Welcome to the Even Better podcast, where your host, Sinikka Waugh of Your Clear Next Step, brings you exciting content about making communities better by helping people get even better at work.
Well, hello, everyone, and welcome to the Even Better podcast. This is Sinikka Waugh of Your Clear Next Step, and the Even Better podcast is part of our ongoing mission to help people have better workdays. So as part of our Better Workday, I am just delighted this morning to be able to bring to you and to have a conversation with my friend Claudia Schabel. Claudia, thank you so much for being here today.
Thank you, Sinikka, for having me. I'm excited to be here.
So for those of you who don't know Claudia, she is the founder and president of Schabel Solutions, which has been around for more than 5 years now. And I've known Claudia for many years, more than that. We worked together in a financial services company from time to time back in the day. And I'm just really delighted in getting to know her and collaborate with her on some women in leadership panel conversations that we worked on together, and to be able to celebrate with her as her organization just passed their 5-year milestone. So the Schabel Solutions team brings together extensive history in DEI and human resources practitioner experience. I know Claudia to be passionate about the topic of diversity, equity, and inclusion. I know her to be supremely capable in this space, and she has created a business that allows organizations to really help understand what they need to do to respond to the dangers of unmitigated unconscious bias, untapped talent, missed market opportunities, and stagnant innovation. She finds organizations who can learn how to respond to those better through the lens of diversity, equity, and inclusion. So they're located in central Iowa. So I get to see Claudia from time to time here in the central Iowa base. And together, I think we're both celebrating right now the very near arrival of spring in this part of the country. So Claudia,
Yes.
Welcome.
Thank you so much. And thank you, all the listeners out there. It's exciting to be able to have this conversation with all of you.
Absolutely. So this conversation is really an important discussion for us to have. So DE&I is now an acronym that enters our workforce that many of us didn't know before. Even with perhaps the last year or so, it's become even more conversational. So diversity, equity, and inclusion. And I think some of those, sometimes we need to understand and sort of reset some of the words in that. And perhaps, Claudia, you can help us understand what we're talking about when we talk about diversity, equity, and inclusion, and maybe how you got interested in that space before we launch into your topic today, which is around 5 trends in the DEI space. So 5 DEI trends to consider. Perhaps, Claudia, you can help us understand what those terms mean, what that space is all about, and how you came into that space.
Absolutely. Happy to. In fact, every time I speak with a group, I ensure that we're starting from the basics, which is really defining terms and language. One thing that I like to mention is that my field is very good about coming up with buzzwords and getting people a bit confused or uncertain if that term actually includes them. And I'm here to clarify that yes, this conversation, it's about all of us. It includes all of us, no matter who you are, no matter where you're located. So let's start with diversity. Diversity, what it means is really about representation. It's how diverse are we in the context of where we live, of where we work, of who surrounds us at all times. So representation can be perceived and considered from multiple aspects that goes beyond age, gender, race, ethnicity. It includes the secondary dimensions of diversity as well, which are your background from an educational perspective, your work experience, your religious beliefs, your geography, where you're located, all of those things that we have acquired throughout our lives and make us who we are today is part of this definition of diversity. So it's a very broad definition, and purposely so, right? Because again, this conversation is about all of us. What I see very often, Sinikka, is that we focus a lot of attention on gender and race and ethnicity and don't quite talk about all the other dimensions. So remember, primary dimensions, the things that we are born with, which includes sexual orientation, gender, and gender identity. And then the secondary dimensions, which are all the other things that we decide to do in our lives. Now, when the second term comes to mind, it's a little bit more difficult for people to understand. So let me start with defining equity by talking about equality. Equity and equality are two different terms. They mean different things. What I think we need to recognize is that as human beings, and maybe particularly Americans, if you have resided in this country for most of your life, the concept of equality is hardwired in our brains. And consciously and unconsciously, we strive for equality. And I think that is wonderful. We should aspire for equality. But without equity, there is no equality. And what equity means is really recognizing that there are some discrepancies, there are some disparities, and then we need to take action to course correct in order to achieve equality. I often tell folks that if you are a runner, if you are a walker, and if you have participated in a road race in your town, in your nonprofit organization has organized, or your local college has organized, you will see that there are different start lines for folks. Runners that are fast runners are ahead of the pack, and then the walkers are the back end of this, road race. And most people seem to be okay with that, and they understand their place in that line and that start line. I think it's time for all of us to recognize that we all have different start lines in life as well. And the moment we recognize that we are starting in different places, we'll be better off in driving equity in order to achieve equality. So this term of equity is not easy to operationalize if you keep stuck on wanting to achieve equality first. Now, when we talk about inclusion is really about leveraging, valuing the diverse perspectives, the diverse backgrounds that we have around the table, that we have in our workplaces, that we have in our communities. And the way we value, the way we demonstrate that we value those backgrounds is really through our actions, through our behaviors. And I often say, diversity for the sake of diversity is not good enough. We have to have inclusivity in order to leverage the gifts, the talents, the ideas, the breakthrough innovation that can happen when you have people from different backgrounds thinking and plotting together to do better in this world.
Claudia, I really appreciate that definition. And as I look back, for years, I've been teaching project management, and I've been a project manager in that large corporate space as well as smaller projects. But one of the things we talk about in project management is the ideal size team. And we use the phrase, the ideal size team is 7 plus or minus 2. It's about that size. And we talk about if it's smaller, and I've been teaching this for years, if it's less than 5, so 7 minus 2, if it's smaller than that, what you're missing is a diversity of thought. You run the risk of a lack of diversity of thought. And I've used that phrase for years, a lack of diversity of thought. And as I teach it, I often will add the phrase, and if all of those people come from the same background that you do and work in the same space that you do and have the same job title that you do and nod vehemently in agreement with everything that you're saying, perhaps your just more numbers is not creating that diversity of thought. So now you've given me different words on inclusivity, that it really is about valuing and celebrating and bringing to the forefront those differences and how valuable they are to what we're talking about.
Exactly. I think the mindset shift that needs to occur within organizations in order to really leverage diversity of thought is to understand that diversity is positive, that needs to be celebrated. It's not an issue. What we also need to recognize, though, is that if we really want to achieve this high level of performance, productivity, and excellence as an organization, we need to work at it. Why? Because when you mix people together from diverse backgrounds, it is more challenging to achieve consensus if that's what we're going for, right? And often we measure productivity if we are able to achieve consensus pretty quickly. So studies show that if you have a homogeneous team in a diverse team, and when I say diverse, I'm mixing things up, but primarily from a racial and ethnic diversity perspective, the research shows that the homogeneous team will more likely short term be more productive because they will agree with each other much more quickly. They're going to get to work much more quickly because they're going to know where they will want to start and how they will want to end. On the other hand, this diverse team will spend more time brainstorming, going off track, or going maybe out of scope, what we might call out of scope. And then really at some point, they will narrow their focus, and then the quality of ideas, the quality of solutions will surpass everything else that could be provided by that homogeneous team. So it doesn't come easily. You have to be intentional and really, in order to achieve high performance and higher productivity and excellence as a diverse organization or even as a community.
Excellent. Thank you. Thank you. So let's get into that. Let's talk about some trends. You have identified for us 5 DEI trends to consider, and those will hopefully spark some action items that we can talk about to move DEI forward in our organizations. So the first trend is around DEI and hybrid work. What trends are you seeing there, Claudia?
Yes, we have been seeing that many employees are now working from home, and many organizations and employees are embracing this concept of having a hybrid workplace. Some organizations allow employees to come in just twice a week and work in their offices, and then the other 3 days or 2 days, however your schedule is, work from home or from a different location. And questions have been arising as to where this kind of arrangement actually will impact the gains made with DEI in the workplace. And I think the new work arrangements can create a completely new set of challenges for employees and for leaders as well. So it is important that leaders and employees continue to stay vigilant as to how they are upholding those values of inclusivity. And here are some specific examples. Remote work makes facilitation of relationships and trust a bit more challenging. We have been hearing about how people have been fatigued just by logging in to their Zoom account and having those meetings without really getting to know people. I'm not saying Zoom is bad. I'm just saying that it might be a bit more difficult to cultivate trust. So, what are some of the tools that employers could put in place to help employees maintain or build trust with each other? We have seen that resolving interpersonal conflicts can be more challenging when you're not in the same space. We have seen that it could be perceived as more problematic because individuals are not necessarily either feeling that they are close to each other or even on the same team when they're so disconnected. So it's important to maintain consistency when communicating with employees about your diversity, equity, and inclusion vision and values. And then thirdly, there is the childcare issue that either we have children or not. I think most of us recognize that it's a very heavy workload for parents that are still having to watch children when maybe their schedules have not been normalized, or where they used to take their children is no longer operating the same fashion and operated 2 or 2.5 years ago. Now, with childcare, we have seen operations being normalized around the country, but there are a lot of families that are still struggling to find a childcare service that they can afford and that is near their home or near someplace else that they can easily access.
Absolutely. So if I'm understanding right, you're bringing some really key points that are coming up in so many conversations, that the conversations that we're having right now about hybrid work and the return to work and what that's going to look like, this will impact our diversity, equity, and inclusion efforts that we might have planned pre-COVID. Before the pandemic, we might have been on a path. We need to perhaps relook at the relook at the path we were on to see how it's impacted now. And if we weren't on a path while we're on this path right now and we're trying to figure out remote work, we need to not forget about the fact that diversity, equity, and inclusion should still be part of our vision as we solve that. Is that a fair understanding?
100%. Absolutely. 100%.
Wow. Oh man. Okay. So I know there's more. So the trend that we're seeing in the DEI space is the trend around DEI and hybrid work. The second trend that you shared that you wanted to highlight today is a focus on the multi-generational workforce. How does that play in?
Yes. Well, let me just be very honest here about my thoughts about this. Well, we have been talking about a multi-generational workforce for about 15 years now, so this may not be a new topic. What I think is interesting is that leaders, organizations are recognizing that millennials and Gen Zs have different expectations when it comes to diversity, equity, and inclusion.
Mm.
I don't think that was ever the case with the previous generations. And if so, it wasn't as obvious as it is now to us. So when we look at this multi-generational workforce, we're not only talking about reskilling or upskilling in the age of automation, we're not only talking about providing wellness programs that include mental wellness programs, we're not talking only about connecting work to social impact and purpose. We're talking about how do we bring your full self to work? And what does it mean to everyone within your workforce? And because of those multi-generational differences, that definition needs to be very thoughtful in order to include everyone. And when I say include everyone, I am not talking about catering to everyone's needs at all times when defining this, but I am saying being aware that those differences exist. And when you, as a leader, you're making those decisions, you have to take that into account in order to have something comprehensive, holistic, that can be very impactful.
Absolutely. So I've been teaching classes for a number of years on to your point, the multi-generational conversation has been going on. And one of the things that we talk about is there are some in the older generations who get frustrated with the young whippersnappers, right? For as long as we've worked, there have always been older people at work and there have always been younger people at work. And there are some things that are universally true. We were all 18 once, right? We all had things to learn, and we all had started a point in our career without a set of experiences that we will gain later on in our career. But I think your observation about the diversity, equity, and inclusion and the expectation there from this younger workforce, I have not observed it in the older generations, and it's not been something that we've talked about. Now, as I'm listening to you talk, I'm realizing I need to go back and adjust my curriculum there to make sure this is part of the conversation as well.
Yes, which to me, this is exciting, Sinikka, because we do need different expectations in order to achieve transformation at a faster pace. What I think leaders need to keep in mind is that this is just the way this generation is expressing themselves, in the way they're coming about aligning their personal values with their work, their professions, how they want to spend their time at work. In having that alignment and feeling good about it is very important to them. Very important to them. So that is important to know because it will impact companies, communities' abilities to attract and retain a healthy workforce.
Absolutely. When I think about the people in the generations that I've worked with over the years, those who have, and perhaps the older generations or my generation have acknowledged that there is the work self and there is that separation between work and life, and this new generation that's talking about bringing their whole selves to work and that authenticity that's so valuable. I hope. I don't know how soon we get there, but I hope we get to a point where all of us have that shared expectation, and it's not just a pressure coming from that younger generation.
Me too. Me too.
So let's get to the third conversation. So the third trend that you're seeing, there's a trend around, the first one was the DEI and hybrid work, definitely some work to be done there. A trend around the multi-generational workforce and what the younger generation, their expectation around diversity, equity, and inclusion. The third trend that you wanted to share about is the impact of unconscious bias in the workplace. We may need to stop and define some terms here on unconscious bias. Talk us through that, Claudia. What is the impact of unconscious bias in the workplace?
Yes, we can talk about the impact of unconscious bias and also talk about the fact that this trend has been top of mind for many years now as well. So let's define unconscious bias. Unconscious bias are those associations and quick judgments that we make in our minds outside of our awareness. And over time, those associations and quick judgments become shortcuts. And those shortcuts help us think really fast and make fast decisions. Those shortcuts can be very beneficial and helpful to us because they help us really move forward with our very busy lives, and we don't have to relearn certain things such as driving, brushing our teeth, walking around. Our brain takes this shortcut, and we unconsciously don't even have to think about it. We just do it.
Mhm.
But unfortunately, those shortcuts are not always aligned with our conscious minds and conscious values and beliefs. Therefore, there could be a discrepancy between our conscious and unconscious mind. And that's where our unconscious biases could really take over and shape our behaviors. So it presents all of us with this dilemma in facing this gap between our good intentions and our impact in the world. And that's why people like you and me think about it, have this conversation. That's why many organizations now are focusing on how the biases of all employees, and particularly managers and leaders, have an impact on organizations' culture and the progress or lack of towards creating and maintaining a diverse and inclusive workplace.
So before we go too far in that conversation on implicit or unconscious bias, I've encountered people who have this sort of, perhaps it's a misperception or an understanding that's not quite right. Because I hear people say, well, unconscious bias, that's bad. And I don't have any of those, right? Unconscious bias is it's by definition, it's a bad thing. And I don't have any of those. What would you say if you're talking to someone like that who says, I've worked them through, I'm all out. I have no more unconscious bias, and because all unconscious bias is bad.
Yeah, no, that is not the case. There are unconscious biases that are associated with positive actions, and there are biases that are associated with negative actions and judgments. And for instance, when I say peanut butter, what comes to mind?
A jar of
For
Jif,
your
right?
a jar of Jif, that's right. For many people, they think similarly a jar of Jif, or they think a peanut butter and jelly sandwich, or they think something else that is right there residing in their subconscious mind. So again, a bias is can be positive and can be negative. We know of a lot of stereotypes. I personally share this association and this bias that when I tell folks that I am from Brazil, often they tell me, I'm sure you're a very good dancer. You must be a great dancer. That is a very positive bias towards Brazilians, and little that they know that I am not a great dancer. Of course, I don't disrupt their bias. I let them believe that I'm a great dancer, Sinikka. But because what harm is there when they think that I'm a great dancer? But again, and that's how we move on to couple this associations that we have with generalizations about groups of people. That's what then leads us to stereotyping, and that's where the danger lies when we start to generalize and stereotype people without really pausing and understand, wait a minute, what judgments am I attaching to those stereotypes or to generalizing certain things about certain groups of people. So when we attach judgment, specifically if it's negative, that's when it can be very harmful. But in many cases, those biases, those shortcuts that we have, they have kept us safe. If I am walking down the street and I see a person that doesn't seem safe to me, which is very subjective, right? Because this is my interpretation of what safe looks like, and I walk away from it, who's to tell me that that person didn't mean any harm? So there are things that we'll never verify. But it would be wrong if I were to tell you, Sinikka, that if a person looks this way, they are dangerous. That's when we're crossing the line and really making this a very harmful behavior of stereotyping people without really getting to know them.
Absolutely. So how does that play out then, the unconscious bias? I know you have some thoughts on supporting gender identity and expression in the workplace, but what does
Absolutely,
that
yes.
do?
Yeah, so first of all, it's important that organizations understand that they need to make an investment in helping their employees understand what unconscious bias is and how it impacts them personally, how it impacts others around them, and how it impacts their work. And then finally, how it impacts the brand of their organizations,
Yeah.
how it impacts the brand of their communities, if you think more broadly. So when we look at the diversity of our workforces today, we're just talking about a multi-generational workforce. If you look at the variety of perspectives, lived experiences, in all the communities and organizations that we have represented in our communities, it is, I think, fair to say that we have a lot of work to do to mitigate all of our biases.
Yeah.
But if organizations are not equipping their employees with tools such as training, it will be more likely that unknowingly they're going to act upon some of those biases and even stereotypes. And when we talk about stereotypes, we're talking about specifically a trend that is pointing out to questioning gender identity.
Mm.
So it is important that employers, leaders, start to understand better what gender identity is, what gender expression is, and how they can better support transgender employees and other non binary employees in the workplace. And I think that conversation can start by addressing some of those biases in order to better support those employees in our workforces today.
I remember on the gender identity and the expression, one of the memes that I saw on a Facebook post or something years ago that really resonated. It was the first time that I understood the conversation differently, and it was a picture of a young student, non-binary perhaps, but the images of the student standing outside of restrooms. And there's a women's sign, and under the women's room or the girls' room, the thought bubble that the individual is thinking is, if I go in there, I get yelled at. And then under the men's room, under there, the thought bubble that what the student was reading was, if I go in there, I'll get beat up. And
Yeah.
what a powerful visual to help people understand that perspective that others, if you have not lived that experience, you might not know. And that's part of
Yes.
what we're doing in diversity, equity, and inclusion, right? We're understanding, we're learning about, we're getting to comprehend someone else's perspective so that we can include them in safe and productive working spaces, right?
Exactly. And what a sad reality too, right? You need to use the restroom and now you're having to decide if you get beat up, if you get mistreated just because you have biological needs. It shouldn't be the case. It should be a safe environment in which you know exactly where to go and be safe. So, if organizations or if individuals listening to us today are wondering, so what's the right answer? A gender neutral bathroom could be a safe option.
Mhm.
And this bathroom could be a one stall, and it could be for all genders. And only one person will be using the restroom at a time. So it will minimize questions, minimize conflict. Now, this scenario might not always work for all organizations. Specifically, I know in some schools, they don't have the ability to have a one stall or one bathroom for all genders. Sometimes transgender kids have to use the nurses office's bathroom in order to have that type of privacy and safety. So this may or may not work for all types of organizations, but that's an idea that has been explored by many organizations and has been implemented very successfully across the country.
Thank you.
And Sinikka, I need to also mention this conversation about gender identity, gender expression often comes down to people, other people, not the transgender kids, but other people feeling offended about the bathroom situation, feeling offended that now they have this transgender kid or this transgender adult coming into their space and making them feel unsafe. But this conversation is so much larger, so much more complex than the bathroom. But it's always interesting to me how people are anchoring all of their beliefs, pro and con, transgender or about gender identity, on the bathroom issue.
Yeah, it's interesting. So there's clearly there's more work to be done. And I can see how this would weave into then that conversation of the impact of unconscious bias, because sometimes these are things that I haven't stopped to think about why that was my thought. What is my belief there? And if I can stop in that moment and challenge that unconscious bias and say, what is that belief? Where is that coming from? Is that based on truth? Is that real? Then I can learn to unpack that and perhaps find a better way.
Yes, absolutely.
So let's look at the fourth trend. If you're just joining us, we are here with Claudia Schabel. We're talking about 5 DEI trends to consider. And if you are just joining the conversation, I'm going to invite you to hit pause and rewind, get all the way back to the beginning, because you need to hear the definition of terms and to get us into this conversation and just to hear Claudia's insights on this, as we've talked about the trends around DEI and hybrid work, the trends around multi-generational workforces, the trends around the unconscious bias in the workplace. And now we're moving on to number 4 is opt-in learning opportunities. Okay, I'm totally curious. Opt-in learning opportunities. What is that, Claudia?
We could just say learning opportunities, but the opt-in is a very important piece of it too. So for instance, I don't know if you remember the times when you were told that certain trainings were mandatory, especially diversity, equity, and inclusion training back in the day. And I don't know of any organization in which that had positive outcomes of having mandatory diversity training, but that used to be a thing of the past. So now the trend is to ensure that all the learning opportunities for employees is about voluntary learning opportunities. No one is pressuring or forcing anyone to go through a training to talk about diversity or equity or inclusion. And this is interesting to me because I always tell our clients when they ask me this question, should we make it mandatory? So it's a catch-22, and here's why. For underrepresented groups, for people of color, for people with disabilities, for LGBTQ plus employees, for veterans, this might be the only opportunity that your colleagues have to learn more about what you go through or topics that you're very familiar with. So in many organizations, the underrepresented groups want this type of learning to be mandatory. But there's always this catch, because when people are being told what to learn or what to think, human nature kicks in. And the first thing that happens is we resist it. Even if people were on the right track to being open to this conversation, the moment we say it's mandatory, unconsciously even, they might resist the topic. So I think this is a trend that we have been recognizing, is that since 2020, after George Floyd's murder, much more emphasis on learning, much more emphasis on trainings for employees and making them optional as people that are seeking for those opportunities have been very successful.
Absolutely. Thank you. Well, and I know on the topic of learning and development, we could go on for a long time, but I'm looking at the clock and I realize that we just have very few minutes and still one more trend to talk about, and that is the transparent and honest conversations. What's the trend there, Claudia?
Yes, we have seen in 2020 many organizations publicly disclosing data around DEI initiatives and even data that could be considered confidential, but they have been very transparent. And this has been setting a new tone for holding organizations accountable by internal stakeholders and external stakeholders. So transparency has been positive. In many cases, a lot of good feedback has been received by those organizations. And then we have seen this hand in hand, I think, a conversation about being transparent and holding conversations about racism, sexism, and all the other isms that impact our workplaces. And these conversations, again, have been sparked out of this social justice movements and reaction to disparities that we have seen during the pandemic and also George Floyd's murder. But I do have a word of caution for organizations that are holding honest conversations about racism, sexism, and other topics that directly impact employees in the workforce. Because if they have not done the foundational work, these conversations may not always be productive. In fact, they could actually make many people misunderstand what diversity, equity, and inclusion is about. So we want to be careful and be prepared and do the hard work before we actually get to having this type of transparency and honest conversations in the workplace.
Absolutely. I love the idea of the transparency. I love the idea of the honesty, but I hear you. It's so valuable that we make sure we understand the terms that we're using and we understand where we're coming from and where we're headed
Exactly.
before
Yeah.
before we just go in and to such topics that often carry so much emotional context with them, right? We get so emotional talking about these things because many of them are very, very personal.
Absolutely. You got it, Sinikka. And that's why I have been telling a lot of our clients, you can't ask employees, I'm sure you can, but you shouldn't necessarily ask employees to jump into these conversations about racism and sexism without giving them a chance to learn more about why it's important to your organization. What are some of the foundational terms and beliefs? And then what are some of the tools to have this conversation in a productive way? And I think that's what we have been seeing many organizations asking their employees and even leaders, holding leaders accountable for spearheading this type of conversations when leaders might not be fully equipped to actually have them.
Thank you. Thank you. So we had a little bit of conversation just prior to going through these 5 trends, the 5 trends around DE&I and things that are going on, the trends around hybrid work, the trends around multi-generational workforces, the trends around the impact of unconscious bias, and the trends around learning opportunities, and the trends around transparent and honest conversations. So we've heard these trends and we've got just a few moments left, Claudia. Is there action? Is there something, if someone's listening to this and they've heard these trends and they're inspired to take action, what actions would you counsel them to do?
Yes, absolutely. Here are 3 actions that I would recommend you do with your organization, especially if you are not sure if you have any DEI efforts in place today. If you already know that your organization is on track, they have a strategy, these actions may not apply to you. But here's the first one. Align DEI efforts with your organization's mission and values. You have to be able to demonstrate your why. Why are you doing this? How does it align with your values? How do you demonstrate that? Number 2, ensure leadership commitment. And what I mean by that is really ensuring that your leadership team understands the why and they are supporting all the actions that need to be taken to carry out your strategy. So having a strategy in place for DEI is extremely important because this work is for the rest of our lives. It's not going to end at the end of the year. It's not going to end next year. So you need to have a roadmap. You need to have a vision. So make sure your leadership team is on board with that vision and developing that vision as well. And then number 3, prioritize DEI work. What does it mean, prioritize? It means allocate time and resources to all the strategic areas such as workplace, workforce, and marketplace. Sometimes we hear people talking about diversity, equity, and inclusion, and they only talk about workforce. But diversity, equity, and inclusion impacts all parts of our organization. It impacts who already is working with us, impacts the people we serve. So when you are prioritizing this work, make sure that you are having tangible efforts and resources allocated to those 3 areas.
Oh, thank you. I love how succinctly you put that, the workforce, the workplace, and the marketplace. Thank you. Claudia, I know we are fast running out of time here. What a joy. Certainly, if any of our listeners want to connect with you and they reach out to us, we will connect them with you. Is there another way that you'd like our listeners to reach out to you if they would like to learn more about your organization or your business?
They can always visit us on SchabelSolutions.com. And thank you, Sinikka, for having me here today. It was a pleasure talking to you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for your time, Claudia. And for those of you who are just joining in, you are at the tail end. You got to go back, rewind, and hear this whole thing. This might be one of those podcasts that you stop and you listen to a couple of times. There are so many useful pieces out of this and things to be aware of as we continue our journey in growing as a community, as a workplace, as a society, and improving and doing even better. On behalf of all of us here at Your Clear Next Step, we thank you so much for listening, and we hope the rest of your day is even better.
Thank you for tuning in today. The Even Better podcast will be back with more content soon. But in the meantime, subscribe to our podcast or check out our website at yourclearnextstep.com for more information. See you next episode.